Hello and welcome back to the show. I love when we're talking about building workplaces where people thrive, not just as employees and leaders, but as whole human beings. And today we are digging into humanity training, empathy and leadership, and mindfulness with our guest. I'm Stephen Skash here again with Mike Lusky. Mike, introduce our guest today.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. Really appreciate that. Yeah, and welcome back really to our followers at another episode of the Bliss Business Podcast. So what's in store for you today? Well, today we have a remarkable guest who's working in really revolutionizing how organizations approach leadership and culture. And with over 28 years of experience as a master teacher, coach, author, and entrepreneur, Lisa Brazelton has pioneered a holistic approach that integrates humanity training, empathy leadership, and mindfulness. And you'll hear that her methods don't just transform organizations, they really empower down to the individual to be able to really recalibrate our lives by helping us identify, number one, what beliefs perhaps are limiting us, and then also how to release those beliefs, which we know can alleviate stress. It'll also help cultivate a mindful culture in an organization and with us as individuals. So in this episode, you'll learn how Lisa's strategies can help you break free from old patterns. They'll enhance your work environment and foster a more resilient, connected team. And if you apply her insights, and Lisa definitely wants to share some real nuggets with you today, if you apply those insights, you can expect to see a significant improvement in your team's productivity, your well-being, the team's well-being, and really the overall business success. So with that, let's welcome Lisa Brazelton to the Bliss Business Podcast. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Lisa,
happy to have you.
Yeah, happy to have you here. This is going to be fun. Can you share with us what humanity training involves and why it's essential for modern organizations and leaders?
Yes. I think that one of the most important characteristics of a good leader is self-awareness. And what is self-awareness? It's a term that's been used a lot. I think self-awareness is the ability to perceive self outside of self. And really what that means is that we have a level of consciousness that is divided, and that dividedness actually, we divide it within itself. So we can perceive something outside of us. And so I think that that's really the bedrock of everything that I'm doing now, is helping people understand who they are. And as leaders, when leaders understand who they are at the core, they can change. They can be amazing leaders and bring about a culture that is truly profound.
Yeah, I always say, as a leader, you need to deal with your shit, basically, sometimes. I mean, because your people don't need that imposed on them. And if you aren't, doing that sort of self-assessment, self-awareness, you aren't aware of kind of the culture and environment and what you're creating because of, things you just haven't worked out in your life or solved. Can you tell me, what inspired you to focus on humanity training, empathy, mindfulness, and leadership? How has your personal journey kind of influenced your work today?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I've spent about 28 years running companies. I started and founded 8 out of the 11 that I helped, all startups. And they're everywhere from insurance to training coordination and logistics to project management, and then leadership training. And so much of my life as a business owner and a CEO, I felt that I was living 2 different lives. I felt like I was having to be, I would say, be a leader and lead an organization, or in my case, I always led multiple organizations at the same time. And then the other side was, well, how do I help humanity? And it was in the mid-teens, 2015, 14, where I realized that I just needed to marry both of that together, basically myself. And that's where it really took. And, I really laid the groundwork for me to get out of being a CEO and into how do I help others become the best version of themselves. And so I feel very called as someone who has spent many years. I've spent over 25 years meditating. I am a devout meditator, and that has really made a huge impact in my life. And I see, just with working with clients, teaching them basic skills in breath work and things like that, it makes a huge impact in their lives. And then when you put that with people who are leading organizations, they end up changing their entire organization because they've changed themselves.
Yeah, I think that some people, like you're talking about, you kind of have this role of, I got to put my CEO cap on today, and you kind of lose your authenticity. Why can't you just be that same person you are at home, at the company, which is probably a more loving, more empathetic person, ideally. And you kind of have that authenticity that you bring to leadership. I think it just makes such a huge difference with, your employees and relating to people as people, and maybe not having more of those horizontal relationships in the workplace.
Well, I don't think we're taught how to do that.
Yeah.
We're taught, as at least when I became a leader, that there needed to be a separation. But I love what's happening in the world right now, where there is losing the mask, losing the persona of having to be someone that we're not. And to really, love the word authenticity, when we become truly authentic. And part of that authenticity is understanding who we are at our core. And how many of us actually know that? How many of us really get to ask the questions of, why am I here? What's the dialogue going in my head? What's that narrative within me? What are my most prevalent feelings that I feel more often? What do I say to myself when I'm feeling upset or frustrated or embarrassed? What do I say to myself when I'm in joy or at peace? We don't take the time, because we live in a 7-second attention span society. We don't take the time to reflect and reset.
And in at work, we don't really have that environment in a lot of places too,
right,
that allow that, right?
Right. Yeah. Right. We don't. But it doesn't mean that we can't. And that's one of the things that I did when I had an organization. Every Monday, we went into meditation before, and it didn't matter where everybody was in the world. And we started with grounding, and we talked about real life issues, and we learned how to support each other. And I think that that was a culture that, even though things were difficult at times, going through the housing crisis was, a big deal for us. And at the time, and people just stayed because they believed in themselves. They believed in me. They believed in what we were doing. And that just was a great testament to the work that I was believing in. And now again, I can do it on the other side. I can do it with leaders, and they're starting to see it too. I mean, I think that there's just there is a change that's happening with the generational gap. And I'm excited to see how we can close that gap and bring knowledge transfer into a complete 360 or a 180 reciprocation. So when there's reciprocity of knowledge, and we can turn that into, doesn't matter what generation you are, that we can work together. We can learn from each other. And so anyway.
That's a great point. And I love the point that you're making where, because kind of like the rat race, right, that maybe we live in today, doesn't allow, for that meditation or that stoppage of time. You really have to buy out the time in order to do that. And being able to do it in groups like that and say, hey, we're going to dedicate the time is a good way to go about it. So Lisa, maybe before we jump into talking a little bit more about empathy in leadership and jumping towards having a resilient team, I want to go back to something that you just said a little bit ago about helping leaders become self-aware, because I feel like there's some of those nuggets in there. Can you share with us, what are some of the things that you do with leaders to try to help them get to that point of being more self-aware?
Yes, absolutely. So I refer to something called into self.
Into self.
Two
Okay.
is a number 2. So it's into self. And self stands for stewardship, exploration, leadership, and fulfillment.
Okay.
And what into self really is it's a perspective that revolves around 3 stances: I and me, I and you, and I and we. And that symbolizes really within, between, and among. And yet there is always a dual perspective, I think, when we're tuning into 2 sides of the same coin. Because everything resides first and foremost within us, within ourselves. And it's that 2 of the into self, the inner and the outer, right? What am I thinking? What am I saying? The masculine and feminine that we all have, right? So that's another 2. The teacher and the student, we are both the teacher and the student, always. We are the giver and the receiver. We have consciousness and subconscious, where we're aware of thoughts and not aware of thoughts, and so on. So that's kind of what I mean a little bit more about how we work with organizations in really diving deeply into this into self perspective.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. And then being able to connect all of those dots. So yeah, thank you for sharing those insights. Let's I guess maybe move over more towards some of the among component of that and talk a little bit about teams. So when it comes to humanity training, being able to contribute really to building a resilient, high-performing team, what would you say that takes, and like how does it contribute to having that kind of a team?
Not to sound like a broken record, but it does require self-awareness within each individual in order to understand that they are a piece of a greater whole. And the I and we, if you will, the among, I feel is where we get to figure out what is our legacy and how do we live our legacy. A lot of times people put legacy with what we want to leave. But I believe that when we can become the best version of ourselves now, we are living our legacy. And so bringing that kind of full circle into teams will be able to expand and grow and nurture when they have this, I would say, more evolved thought process of it's not just me, it's a collective, but I also have a very important role in that. And like any wheel, right? You can't have one spoke off or else the wheel won't work. So hope that answers your question, Mike.
Yeah, no, I think it does. And I think the importance of doing it, as you said, sort of in times of, peace or where you've got, a team, because as soon as you introduce uncertainty or some, big fracture or change, the among could go out very quickly, right? And all of a sudden we start to look in, back to the self or internally. So having those practices, I think, well in advance of times of uncertainty and radical change are good things. On the show, we've had this I guess, analogy we could say of two sides of a coin, and you sort of brought it up as well. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about capitalism and community and humanity, and how there's such this huge challenge between some of those, because they are, in a way, two sides of the same coin, but how empathy can really allow the two sides to see each other, right? Because if a capitalistic society that is more conscious of humanity, by demonstrating empathy, can then see, both sides of the same coin. So I wanted to talk a little bit about empathy in action, and see if maybe you could describe for us a time that you witnessed empathy in action, that then had some kind of transformative impact in a culture's success.
Within clients or within my organization?
Any really. I mean, maybe within a client's or both, if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, you had a recent experience with a client. There was some issues with the board, and someone needed to step down, and there was just a lot of friction.
Okay.
And one of the things that we did together, I was working with the CEO, who there was definitely friction there with the person who really knew that she needed to step down, but was resisting it a bit. And I helped actually bring about what's going on underneath the upset. Not only, mainly with the person who was stepping down. What's underneath that layer? Business is not black and white. It's gray, right? We can be data-driven all day long, but if we cannot open ourselves up to understand what are people really going through? And so we really uncovered, we uncovered multiple layers of, well, what are her gifts? What did she do? Maybe she was doing things that she didn't realize that she had to do, and that caused the circumstances to be where she really needed to step down. Can we apply real grace, and allow someone to feel that they were appreciated, that they really gave their service? And so that's what happened. And I wasn't in the meeting, but I got a phone call right after the meeting that said it went better than anybody could have ever expected. And it was well received. And even though there was a little emotion, it wasn't contentious. It was embraceful, because one nurtured the other. And that actually has already, even a few weeks later, has already had a trickle effect down to the rest of the board. And think about how easy it is to be kind. It doesn't cost anything to be kind. And when we can get out of our way, and that's another perspective, right? We sometimes often think that someone's issue is real. It's really our issue, right? So when we can turn that and look at ourselves in the mirror, sometimes what upsets us about another is really something that has occurred in our life, whether it's childhood, whether it's experiences. So I'm a big fan of helping organizations, helping leaders actually move through grace in order to see a bigger, broader perspective of maybe what's going on. And it just reduces reaction. It reduces this kind of upward and outward, like an oak tree. It reduces the the ability to, or the reaction to, judging and blaming, right?
Yeah.
I love that you brought up grace. I bring it up a lot, and I don't think people realize it. Just pause for a moment and to provide a little bit of grace when, maybe you're right about something, maybe you've got a really good opinion about something, or maybe you're really angry about the way, some sort of injustice. We could name probably a gazillion of them in society right now. But we're never going to get anywhere really if we don't have grace and we don't express grace, because without it, it's so disconnecting. We are so disconnecting with each other.
Mhm.
And we just, I don't know, we've lost it, I think, quite a bit. I feel like we've slipped quite a bit with our grace in the past, decade or so, just with the climate of not just politically, but I think even social media, right? Because it's just kind of the algorithms are almost designed for the extreme.
Right.
And extreme does not appreciate grace. That's exactly what it lacks, I think. So I just wanted to kind of underline just the importance, I think, of grace in your interactions.
Yeah, and I would say we just haven't remembered. I feel that there's so much about self-awareness and deeper connections to our own consciousness that are there, but we've just forgotten.
Yeah, and if you go in that space, you're going to see that sort of interconnectedness,
right,
eventually.
Right. I mean, in going back to this oak tree, which I love as a metaphor, it really shapes, how we react to life's events and how it influences our, our perceptions and our choices and our decisions. Again, the branches reflect this upward and outward reaction, blame. It's very head, it's very intellectual. The inward downward of the roots and the trunk and the roots, that is what roots us. And it's where we can retreat and we can reflect and we can pause. I'm a big fan of pausing, because pausing creates or provides clarity. And when we have clarity, we're bringing the head down to the heart where we can emotionalize something. And the oak tree is like this beautiful balance between two movements. And when we can become both that student and know that the student and the teacher, the giver and the receiver, we're not just nourishing ourselves, but we're nourishing everyone else around us.
I love that analogy, for sure. And making sure too that we're taking in, good things, so that we're not rotting from the inside out. But but yeah, your point on grace, I definitely wanted to underscore that as well. And I think as well, it brings up what we like to call the art of the win-win-win, right? Like you said, it ended up helping both of the individuals, but then even the board in that instance benefited, right? So it even escalated the amount of growth and benefit there.
Well, I feel like we have forgotten our humanness.
Mm-hmm.
And as Stephen, you were saying, with grace and the things that we can do simply, practically, getting out of our way is a big thing, and pause is a huge player in my playbook. Whenever I am uncertain about something, whenever I feel a little trepidation, I pause. And it doesn't matter how long I pause for. I pause because I know I need to, because I choose no longer to react.
Perfect. That's a perfect segue.
I was going to say, just a reminder to our listeners, we are live on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook. If you've got questions, go ahead and submit them. Mike, what were you about to say? Go for it.
Yeah, no, that's what I was going to welcome. Obviously appreciating our fans that are on, live with us. So if there are questions, definitely want to include your questions and comments and thoughts into the conversation. So,
Lisa, I want to ask you a question. You mentioned legacy a little bit, and I've been thinking about this just a little bit more in terms of, we talk a lot about building love into systems, how you can do that. And the key part of having it as part of a system, that's a scalable system, is that if you're able to build love into that in some way, that is kind of a way of leaving a legacy of some type. Even if you move on from a company, that you've positively influenced the company in some way, and you've left your mark in a way. In your view, what legacy should conscious leaders aim to leave behind in their organizations?
I think I love the question. We can leave behind all the riches in the world, or we can and be remembered by how many deals we made, how we brought a company up from X to Z. But I often wonder how many leaders want to leave a legacy of that people have seen them as being the best person, the greatest teacher, the kindest person, the most fair and just, a belief system to be believed in, to be respected and honored. These are their words, and they're very emotional words, but they are so important, I think, for leaders to really want to contemplate about how they want to leave, or even an individual, right? Somebody working in an organization.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't have to be
It doesn't have to be a leader,
just a
right?
leader.
But
It could be anyone.
how do you want to be remembered? Do you want to be remembered by being the most difficult person? Do you want to be remembered by being someone who's fiercely flexible? Someone who is kind and thoughtful? And we get to choose that at any moment. And that's a key word right there. Choose, choice. A lot of people don't think that there is a choice, but again, with self-awareness and really deepening through contemplation, concentration, and I think meditation, we get to understand who we are, and we get to be accountable for those things that we want to think, feel, act, behave.
It's a great. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Steve.
I was just going to say, thinking about how do we scale that empathy across like large organizations? How do we, in your mind, how can leaders ensure that it remains kind of a core value or something that, like you said, legacy? How can we do that across our teams and operations so people grow, and when things get stretched, we aren't suddenly losing that empathy, that grace. In your mind, how can we scale empathy?
I think empathy can be scaled by learning what empathy really is and putting it into practice. And I do believe very strongly that it starts with leaders. Several years ago, when I started an organization in helping organizations, one individual at a time, become more conscious, I was in a situation with a very big company in Chicago. And they said, "Oh, we love the program. We're excited. We want all of our junior managers and below to take all the classes and the program." And I said, "Okay, and what about you, C-suite?" And they said, no, we won't do that. Well, I actually walked away from a very big deal. It was a big, very lucrative deal. I walked away because I said, I will not be responsible for I was a little dramatic. I said, "You're going to have a civil war on your hands within your organization, and I'm not going to be accountable for that. If you can't see that is, you're setting your organization up to absolutely implode, I don't think this is a good fit." So, but to answer your question, an organization can scale their level of empathy by bringing accountability to leadership, to management, to teams, to individuals. And working as a collective whole does take time to move that, depending on the size of an organization. But with intention I mean, intentionality is I always say when we put our attention on our intention, a lot of things can change. And it doesn't have to be this overdrawn, heavy. It could be light. It could be joyful. It could be forgiving. And when there's that combination with training, because again, without the training, it may be a free-for-all. But with specific programs, like, I have many, organizations are able to really understand, and things start to get lighter. And when they get lighter, change happens. And when change happens, there's a lot of joy. I've seen it.
That is definitely a beautiful thing, to be able to witness. I love a lot of the practical advice, Lisa, the tools that I think our audience could very quickly implement. Earlier, prior to the show, we were talking about 3 of the words that you like to use, and I just really appreciated how thoughtful and practical those were. I was wondering if you could share those with our audience. How have you used them? How do you think about them?
Are we talking about mindfulness and empathy?
I think and then I think it was service was one of them, maybe.
Yeah, service. I mean, when we get to serve, that's what the state I'm in right now in my life. Everything that I'm doing is out of service. And I believe that when we understand how to serve others, we get to learn the depths and the breadth of humility. And humility is part of being human. And when we resist those things, then it's a good idea. I mean, for me, I think the resistance is we see that often. Well, it's not my fault. It's somebody else's fault, right? It's not my issue. It's somebody else's. When we learn how to know that resistance is truly our friend, and resistance can be the very first piece to looking within, anything is possible. So, stewardship is a big deal for me in my world, in my life, and what I, teach my son. And when we get to embrace how we help others, the narrative that kind of goes on in our own minds, sometimes when we're ruminating things over and over again, that just goes away, or that volume goes down, because we're focused on someone else, something else that's bigger than us.
Right. So someone might ask, well, but how do I do that? Right. Like, what's your approach to overcoming that resistance? Are there any, mindfulness practices that someone could do that to do that?
There's so many. There's so many. So I like I said, I talked about the oak tree. I like to use the old-fashioned analog radio as a great metaphor.
Okay.
And those analog radios, remember, AM and FM, they're just dials, and those dials, we just get to pick a station. But all stations exist simultaneously, right? Mm-hmm. We can only hear one station at a time. But life is similar. I think life is similar in that even though there are an infinite amount of stations, right, that we can tune into, like the filter of our voice, the way that we're thinking about things, our perspective, our set of beliefs, our habits, okay? We're only focused on one station. But are we really choosing the right station for us? Or are we allowing distraction to be the default setting? Do we like the station that we're tuned into? So I believe that when we think about how life is similar to a radio station, and we've been on this particular station for a long time, we get through different practices and tools, we get to learn how to tune and change the dial. I call this a systems setting change. We prioritize what we put our attention on. I always say this, people know this, we get what we focus on. So if you don't like what's going on, change your focus. Because we're going to get what we focus on. We're all made of energy. Everything is energy. Everything has a vibration. We can talk about quantum physics maybe at another time. But when we get to understand that it's our thoughts and our feelings that put the pebble in the pond that's still, and those ripples are the experiences that we have. Now I get to think differently about what pebble I want to put in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great analogy. And I love, obviously the use of analogies, because you can go back to it. It gives you something to think about and, put into practice. So yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense.
Thinking about those stations and what we focus on. I mean, this is one of the big discussion points we have when we're talking about business systems is we're always just focused on, sort of the profit KPI, right? This is the metrics we're looking at day in, day out, something related to the profit, and not really any sort of love-based, empathetic-based metrics. And so if we're just tuned in to that station, that one profit-based station, we've seen all kinds of business scandals, all kinds of things go sideways and wrong because there wasn't that empathetic approach, or there aren't more empathetic minded people, managing that situation, because you got to manage it if you're just going to be focused solely on profit, because people are going to do crazy things. Do you think that there are metrics or indicators that companies and leaders should focus on that kind of assess the effectiveness of empathy and mindfulness initiatives, or how should we view that? We could focus on those stations, and that's a starting point, I think, right? And then every organization may have their own answer to that. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in, and I do a lot of training with leaders and individuals in intuition. Understanding intuition, knowing how to listen to intuition, trusting in our intuition, and going beyond data-driven decision making and KPIs. And I said this word before, but how do we navigate ambiguity? Because business isn't not black and white. And I do believe that, with looking beyond just KPIs, looking beyond data, we can, through even understanding intuition and pressing into intuition, we can actually quantify data differently by understanding efficiencies differently. Why? Because we're starting to see things from a different perspective. We can identify different gaps. We can analyze maybe different sales data that we've been watching, but we haven't been able to really get beyond the ambiguity. Maybe we can, navigate the organization differently because now perspective changes. And as perspective changes by understanding oneself, the filters that may have been on before, they change. Maybe they come off. Maybe they change colors, right? So the analogy of, somebody, 50 people witness an accident, you're going to get 50 different perspectives. You're not going to get the same perspective. When we can really take a step back in that analogy of the oak tree and get grounded and get reflective and understand who we are and understand that voice that keeps on coming up, that narrative that's always saying, you're not smart enough, you're not good enough, that person is out to get you, all the narrative that goes. When we can lower the volume, our perspective shifts. And when our perspective shifts, the business shifts. we start seeing people differently. We start to respond versus react differently.
Yeah, I think when we talk about like consciousness evolving, it is really just the ability to take on more perspectives over time, and you kind of lose what some of the ego that's just there, not allowing you to see all the different perspectives you can. And I think you can take that over to organization as well. A lot of us are focused on the perspective of, solely shareholder value, or, this one perspective, and not on the employees or the customers as much, or the community, right? Or your partnerships. I'm reading this book, and it's on this large leverage buyout. And I know the results are that several thousand people are going to lose their jobs at the end of this story. What really struck me in those boardroom meetings and conversations is there's almost no talk by the leadership about the impact this was going to have on the employees. And, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, because it's, kind of all too common. But what do you say to someone who says empathy and love doesn't belong in business? Like those people, like this service is, I want my employees to do your training, but not us. Like, what do you say to those people who say empathy and love don't belong in business?
Good luck, because life and humanity is evolving, and it's evolving at a very rapid pace. And people are waking up from being in a slumber for a very, very, very long time. And if the old school way of thinking of, me, myself, I command, is going to disintegrate, because it already has started. That's what I will say. So good luck, because I don't think things will work out as planned. I also really appreciate using the word love. I remember when I was a young CEO, someone said to me, you cannot bring emotion into any business. It's strictly, it's strictly business. It's not emotion. And I rebutted back, and I said, everything that I do is based on my emotions. I trust my feelings. But how can we trust our feelings if we don't understand them, right? So again, it goes back to self. It constantly goes back to self. And when we're vulnerable enough, and when we want to be more superhuman, which I think we're starting to see more and more superhuman people out there, we can make a huge impact in the world just by changing ourselves, just by opening up a little bit. And authenticity is so important. So I know I just went beyond that, but I don't think that there's going to be room for big organizations or organizations that have that control and command mindset anymore. It's changing. And love is the answer. It is.
Yeah.
I would have to say my money's on empathy and love.
Yeah, no, it's a 4-letter word in business people don't want to talk about. But yeah, we're doing that every day. So, Lisa, where can people learn more online about you and your work?
Thank you. Sage Prosperity Partners is the organization. Been around for 6-7 years now. I've got a nonprofit, but we're just going to focus on that. Podcast, Wisdom from the Edge on YouTube. You can find me there. I have some publications. I've written 68 courses and programs that I'd love to share with anybody who's interested. And I have a published book that you can find on the website of Sage Prosperity Partners. And my next book will be out, called Wisdom Rewired. We didn't talk about wisdom, but that'll be out by December of this year.
Well, yeah, I'd love to have you back and we could talk about that. Lisa, thank you. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
And thanks also to our listeners. As a reminder, you can catch us again on Tuesday, where Tulio, Ash, and I take deep dives into various topics to help you add more empathy, consciousness, and connection to your business and work life. On Wednesdays, we have our short 10-minute episodes. Right now, we're covering what we call the Empathy Expansion Kit for your business. And on Thursdays, we are live with our great guests. So we will see you on the next Bliss Business Podcast.
Thank you.